As part of your proxy statement filed with the SEC, you will disclose information about an equity compensation plan if it's going to be on your ballot for shareholder approval at your next annual shareholders meeting. Today on Zippy Point. I'm Broc Romanek and I'm a big fan of yous. So before I bring on Reid Pearson to give us the practice tips about how to best present your case to obtain shareholder approval of a new or amended equity plan, let's run down some of the disclosure basics. I should also mention that I have a separate vid guide about the equity compensation plan information table that you need to include in your Form 10-K about your equity plans when none of your plans will be voted upon at the next annual shareholders meeting. There isn't any new plan or modification of an existing plan that needs shareholder approval. The link to that vid guide is beneath this video. So which plans need approval? The SEC rules don't dictate when you need to put up a new equity plan or an amended one for shareholder approval. That comes from the stock exchange where your company has listed its stock. Each of the NASDAQ and the NYSE have rules that provide a non-exhaustive list of the kinds of revisions that would require shareholder approval, as well as some limited exemptions from the requirement. So you want to see these sections of the NYSE listed company manual and NASDAQ listing rule 5635C. In addition to their listing standards, you will also want to look at the FAQs that each exchange has. Here's the FAQs that the NYSE has for section 303A08, and then NASDAQ's listing center, their webpage for that, provides a bunch of FAQs and staff interpretation letters regarding Rule 5635C. So have a look at those. Or sometimes it's an IRS Treasury thing that requires shareholder approval within 12 months before or after board approval of a plan in order for the awards to be eligible for treatment as incentive stock options under Section 422, or for plans that constitute qualified employee stock purchase plans under Section 423. So let's talk about the disclosure legal requirements. Those emanate from Item 10 of Schedule 14A. That's the source of the requirement here. Item 10 really covers the waterfront. Disclosure under it is required whenever action is to be taken at a shareholder meeting on any compensation plan. That includes not only equity, but also cash plans or pension or retirement plans. But of course, equity plans are the most common these days. Instruction 1 to Item 10 defines plan quite broadly. In theory, it could be a plan with just one participant, but in practice, individual compensation arrangements are not structured as a plan and don't require shareholder approval typically. Item 10 is in addition to Item 402 of Regulation SK. While there is some overlap, Item 10 is broader in scope as it will elicit information about your compensation plans, even if no executive officers or directors are participants. So in addition to disclosures about new plan benefits for the NEOs and named executive officers covered by Item 402, Item 10 requires aggregate disclosure for three other specific groups. 1, all executive officers. 2, all directors who are not executive officers. And 3, all employees, including all current officers who are not executive officers. Know that the new plan's benefits table may supersede the equity compensation plan informations table in certain circumstances. And you'll learn more about that in my separate vid guide about that equity compensation plan information table. So what to disclose? Under items 10A1 and 2, your new plan's benefits table will disclose the potential benefits and amounts to be provided under the new or modified plan, as well as a brief description of the plan's participants and its material terms and conditions. For amendments or modifications to a plan, Item 201D of Regulation SK provides the requirements for the type of disclosure that you'll be giving for securities that were previously authorized for issuance under the plan being amended or modified, while also other information about the additional securities that are subject to the proposed modification. So in summary, you have a prescribed table and then a little bit of narrative disclosure, and you'll see some examples of that soon enough. As noted in this CorpFin staff interpretation, all of the required officers and groups go into the table, so even if they won't be receiving anything under the plan, you still include them and indicate then that the amount is 0. As noted in the instruction to the new plan's benefits table, so there's a single instruction in the table itself, and then a list of instructions a little bit further down in Item 10. But under this broad instruction to the table itself, if you're going to have more than one plan on the ballot, you're only going to have one table in your proxy. You just add more columns to the table to add in the information for all the different plans that will be voted upon. That's something to note. Instruction 5 to item 10 requires you to inform the SEC when you plan to register the securities that underlie any plan options, warrants, or rights, or to explain why the securities won't be registered and what's your basis for exemption from registration. This is done by providing supplemental correspondence to the SEC staff to CorpFin that you send in via Edgar when you file a proxy, so you don't disclose that information in the proxy itself. Reid will talk to us in a moment about what disclosures you're going to want to make in more detail, but you definitely want to address the reasons behind an increase in the amount of shares, any projections you considered, any potential dilution. Those are things that the proxy advisors want to know. Those are things that your institutional investors and your retail investors want to know. You're going to have to address the tax consequences, both to the company and their participants in the plan, if the plan will include options, warrants, or other rights. And you'll even need to discuss plan amendments that are being made that are apart from the plan amendments that triggered the need for shareholder approval. That's pursuant to item 10A3. So this is a little tricky. Instruction 3 to item 10 requires a company to file a copy of the plan with the SEC, but Schedule 14A doesn't allow for exhibits like other Exchange Act forms. So you'll need to disclose a copy of the plan itself as part of your proxy filing. This is typically done by appending it to the end of the proxy. It's not stuck in the body of the proxy itself. So it's not right where you have the disclosure, the tables, whatever graphics you're using, trying to solicit votes. This plan is typically appended at the end. And if you do it this way, then you're not required to deliver a copy of the plan document to shareholders separately. Okay, that wasn't hard to explain. I'm sure I didn't do it well. But the issue arises because what investors and proxy advisors, what they want to see is they want the plan itself to be appended. And Reid and I are going to talk about this in a minute when we're talking about ISS's equity plan scorecard model. That's what ISS uses to evaluate whether they want to support your plan or recommend a vote against. So let's briefly look at a few examples. Here's Schwab's 2020 proxy for an amended stock option plan. It has 6 pages of disclosure and the new plan's benefit tables at the end. And here's the amended plan for itself for Schwab appended to the end of the proxy. Regeneron's 2020 proxy is 8 pages of disclosure for an amendment to an LTIP plan. The plan is appended at the end. And they have all sorts of graphics in their disclosure, a key equity metrics to illustrate the burn rates, overhang, and dilution. Telling your story in this area is important to get in the vote. And then finally, here is Lockheed Martin's 2020 proxy. There's 9 pages of disclosure. They're approving a new plan, incentive performance award plan. Plenty of graphics in here showing the dilution, burn rate, highlights, and summary. It's good stuff. And now I'm going to introduce Reid, and off we go. Our guest today is Reid Pearson. He's Executive Vice President of Alliance Advisors and leads that solicitor's corporate governance group. I've known Reid forever. He is the man when it comes to shareholder approval of equity plans, but he's not a one-trick pony. He knows everything you need to know about proxy solicitation. He's based in Atlanta, but he's one of the busiest people I know. He's jetting all around the country all the time. He's tireless. I'm Broc Romanek, today on Zippy Point.
Quick Zips by Zippy Point.
Quick and dirty. So Reid, shareholder approval of equity plans, and I know by the time you're brought in many cases, it's sort of an adversarial situation that one of the proxy advisors might have recommended against shareholder approval of the equity plans, or as you'll discuss with us, maybe it's both ISS and Glass Lewis. But let's start with the disclosure piece. What types of narrative disclosures do you typically see to explain why the plan should be approved?
One of the most common disclosures that we see is, kind of out of a bulleted list of, why shareholders should support the plan. It may include things like, our burn rate, our dilution are reasonable. We don't have any negative kind of plan provisions like repricing or an evergreen. We have a broad-based plan, and we think the plan is going to last for the next 2 to 3 years. So, and again, kind of just, and these are nice things, but I also think the more impactful disclosure has to do with something that's much more targeted. So in other words, a company has kind of done their homework. They've compared their plan to the policies of their institutional shareholders and have kind of picked out, okay, we've got a couple of weak spots here. Now, it could be, for example, like burn rate is an issue. And even though we've got Netgear pulled up here, I would tell people take a look at also at Evercore's proxy from 2020. They've done a good job talking about the burn rate. But so, for example, burn rate may be an issue, and you'll see kind of clear disclosure about why the burn rate might be considered high versus some institutional policies, right? It's kind of the nature of our business. You do a comparison next to what we consider to be direct peers, how we might be offsetting potential, dilution by a share repurchase program. So kind of talking that through, and you'll notice on this example here, this is kind of what Netgear has also done, where they've kind of talked about their burn rate, and then a little bit lower down, they actually talk about their forecasted kind of grant practices to give an idea to shareholders about what burn rate may be looking like in the future. The other narrative disclosure I think that's really key for shareholders to understand is again, tell your story and tell your message. What you see here is a supplemental proxy that Netgear put out shortly after the ISS report came out, and they did a very good job of explaining to shareholders, again, why the plan was important, but also tying in the equity usage to the overall story of the company's plan. The other thing I think that's important, and the other thing that this illustrates, that this Netgear supplemental illustrates, is overcoming a negative ISS recommendation. So the company had a sense that ISS was not going to support the plan. So what they did was they spent some time crafting a message to say, look, although we respect basically saying, although we respect the ISS recommendation, we'd like you to kind of look beyond that and consider these other factors. And so what you'll see here is kind of a rebuttal, but again, a professional rebuttal. And I say that because we do find that some shareholders, they don't want us to be in a kind of an attack mode against ISS because this is a policy that they follow. So, you can kind of respectfully disagree with the ISS recommendation while at the same time kind of pointing out your own reasons for why you think shareholders should support the plan. So again, I think this is actually an excellent piece of disclosure with respect to the kind of overcoming a negative ISS recommendation, as well as kind of telling your story.
That was a piece of some supplemental proxy material. On average, if you have sort of this contested situation with the proxy advisor recommendation, might you have more than one piece of proxy supplemental material? Or is there typically just that one marketing piece?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's typically one, although you will notice there's going to be, like, if you look at, for example, like Evercore put out a couple of ones as well. So what I normally see is that it is usually one additional piece of supplemental, but at times it can be two and sometimes three. But I feel like that I think a lot of people will say, like, the more supplementals you get, it's harder for all these shareholders to digest it, particularly during a proxy season. So I think if you can kind of put it together in one piece, I think that's helpful.
So if you happen to get a recommendation from both Glass Lewis and ISS, you would try it if those came in around the same time, which it seems like they would. You would just have one supplemental piece. You would. And I think, Brock, too, that also depends on your shareholder base too, right? I mean, you want to analyze. I mean, typically for most shareholders, ISS is going to have more of an influence than a Glass Lewis. So if you've got to kind of split on who you're addressing, I think more people would say, okay, we want to kind of rebut the ISS recommendation as to Glass Lewis. But yes, if the timing works, then you can take care of both in one supplemental. And I noticed both the Netgear proxy and then that piece of supplemental material both use graphs. I think I saw one chart, and I would imagine that's pretty useful to shareholders too, to understand the story and by glancing at a graph and looking at the numbers.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, charts and graphs are really, really important. I mean, shareholders are looking at thousands of proxies every year, and so something that kind of stands out and tells your story is going to be helpful. Here's up on the screen, you'll see I think, which is a really, really good example from Evercore, talking about their burn rate. Again, they knew ahead of time that burn rate was going to be a factor that a number of their institutional investors were going to look for. So they really tried to tell the story about repurchase They showed the net grants. So in other words, what they were trying to get to was to say, look, when you look at our net burn rate in considering our share repurchases, we actually have a negative burn rate. So the share repurchase program is kind of offsetting a lot of the dilution that we get from burn rate. But what's also important about this one is talking about the nature of the kind of the business. As I talked about earlier, tell your story. Evercore is an advisory firm. It's a total human capital company, and equity is a huge part. And I know that kind of concept, as well as the graph, really worked with a lot of the shareholders that have their internal guidelines.
Great stuff, Reid. So what do you do if you don't know the exact amounts that could be issued under a new or a modified plan? Do you provide an estimate?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to a couple of things. What we'll encourage a company to do is estimate about how many shares they think they're going to need for the next 1, 2, 3, or 4 years. Institutional investors typically like companies to come back to a shareholder vote, every 2, 3, or 4 years. It's not a written policy, but it's just kind of preference that they have. So again, we ask companies to kind of estimate what they think they're going to need over the next several years. Then they take those numbers and they compare them to the policies of their institutional investors. And that way you can kind of triangulate a number and get an estimate for what you think shareholders would likely to support based on their policies. And again, it depends on the company, but you typically look for somewhere around a 2 or 3 year ask, or new share ask. And what we'll do is we actually will take a look at that, take a look at the various new shares. We'll compare that to the shares. We'll do kind of a pseudo projection. So we'll say, okay, well, if ISS recommends against the equity plan, do we have enough support from other shareholders based on their policies and their guidelines to get the plan passed? One thing too, I'd also point out is equity plans typically are going to require a majority of the votes cast, right? So whereas say on pay and director votes, people want to see 70 or 80% of support levels. It's basically on equity plans. There's none of that need for that. It's just basically the 50% of shares cast. So that projection also allows a company to kind of see, well, okay, we can or we can't, do this without ISS. I tell everyone, before you sign up on the ISS consulting side, do your analysis, do your review of the plan, and have an estimate to determine, okay, well, can I get it done without ISS? And then you can make that decision. If you say, yeah, I can, but it's going to be too close, maybe let's just go see what ISS has to say. So it just kind of helps provide a little bit more information to help you make a good decision.
So this is a curious question. You might not know the answer, but I've always found it interesting that companies do appear to always append the actual plan to the end of the proxy that's delivered to shareholders, rather than providing a mere summary, which is allowed by the SEC's rules. But
yeah,
I think the proxy advisors and investors want to see the whole plan, even though that's a lot of legalese to read.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head. I think a lot of the need to put the plan in the proxy, the full plan document in the proxy, is driven by ISS and Glass Lewis. Primarily ISS, I think. I mean, when they evaluate a plan and make a recommendation on the plan, they look at a lot of different variables, and some of which they're going to be in maybe not in the summary, but in the plan document itself. So I think that's one reason that ISS requires it. Also too, there's at times, and it doesn't happen very often, but at times you might see a discrepancy between what the plan says and what the plan document is. And actually ISS, and well, in fairness to them, most shareholders as well, would go to the plan document to say, okay, well, this is kind of the overriding document because, as you said, this is the legal document.
The plan trumps the proxy disclosure.
Exactly, it trumps the proxy disclosure. The other thing I'd say too is that ISS, they put a lot of data on their report that I'm sure you've seen, and some of which may not be relevant to their methodology. And I think the reason for that is there are a number of shareholders that get the ISS report, although they don't necessarily follow the recommendation. So basically ISS is doing the homework for some other investors that may not want to dig through the actual plan document. So they're, acting as kind of a data resource, and their report is being used by other investors other than just making the record.
ISS's evaluation process, that's called Scorecard, right? And that's,
Yep.
Can you give us sort of a high level overview of the main thresholds that they're looking for?
So it's as you said, it's the equity scorecard that they use. It is a proprietary system, and basically, a company has to accumulate a certain amount of points over an established threshold for ISS to support the plan. So ISS has what they call 3 pillars. The first being what they call plan cost, and this encompasses their shareholder value transfer or SVT. This is a binomial model that ISS has used for years, and it basically kind of estimates the average award value, and it kind of compares that to a peer group. So again, proprietary model. This is the kind of the data point that a lot of companies have to sign up on the consulting side if they want to kind of figure out what ISS is going to, or how many shares ISS is going to say a company can ask for. So again, kind of proprietary model. The second piece of it is called grant practices. And the bulk of the scoring here is when a company's 3-year average burn rate. Basically, a company will get a certain amount of points depending upon how high or low they are to an established cap. So again, it's a 3-year average burn rate, and ISS applies a multiplier to the full value awards, and basically the non-options, non-SARs in the awards. They get a multiplier, so they count more than one depending upon the stock price volatility. So under this grant practices pillar, it is the burn rate that accounts for most of it, but there's some other factors. Does the company have a holding period? Does it have a clawback? The use of performance-based awards for the CEO. So there's a number of different factors. The third piece of this is what they call plan provisions. So this includes things like change in control provisions. What's been the kind of historical vesting? Is there a minimum vesting requirement? So a number of different kind of variables that go into this. So those are the 3 pillars, and then obviously overriding this is some kind of what we call deal killers. Repricing without shareholder approval. If there's a liberal change in control definition, then ISS, regardless of how many points you actually accumulate, ISS may actually recommend against the plan if you've got any of these provisions. And these are provisions that other shareholders are looking at as.
Yeah, the egregious pay practices.
The egregious pay practices, yes, sir.
So in comparison, how does Glass Lewis evaluate plan proposal?
It's interesting. Different models, but still proprietary. So they have a kind of a quantitative, model. What they're doing is looking at plan cost, which is basically the same thing. It's their version of the shareholder value transfer. They're also looking at the pace of granting, which again is basically their version of a burn rate. They compare this to a number of kind of factors that they think are key for measuring performance, and they compare them to a peer group. They run it through a series of tests, and if you pass enough of these tests, then they may end up recommending for the proposal. But again, it's proprietary. It's funny. I was kind of thinking about this a little bit, and Glass Lewis, when it comes to equity plans, we've always taken the approach of, well, we really won't know until they release their report. So when we sit there and we do maybe a projection for companies on equity plans, we always kind of assume Glass Lewis is going to be the unknown. And it's just typically that they don't have as much influence as ISS does, or even the bucket of institutional shareholders that have their own internal guidelines. So I'm not saying to ignore Glass Lewis, but what I'm saying is it just the way that their methodology works, people just kind of put them off to the side and just, I guess hope that they end up supporting the plan,
And then you have the institutional investors. I know you've talked to me about many instances where both proxy advisors recommended a vote against, but yet companies were able to still prevail because, again, you're only looking just for a majority vote. what are the major institutional investors? What are they looking for that the proxy advisors might not be?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I think it's really the institutional investors that carry the day. I mean, if you look at the stats, there are very few equity plans that actually fail, and I think a lot of that has to do with those shareholders that have their own internal have their own internal guidelines. From a quantitative perspective, a lot of these independent, what we call independent shareholders, they look at burn rate, they look at the voting power dilution, and they're much more simple calculations, right? They don't typically have the models that ISS and Glass Lewis have. So they're more straight line burn rate and dilution calculations. Now, what they find acceptable may differ across the institution, and some of them have strict guidelines. So if you're above 12%, we're not going to support the plan. Most of them, though, have consider burn rate and dilution as more of a screen, right? That we're going to look at these numbers, see where you are. If you're under these kind of our screens, then we'll probably just support the proposal. If you're above, we want to kind of understand your story. And I think this is one of the key aspects that differs kind of these independent shareholders from ISS and Glass Lewis, right? ISS and Glass Lewis basically say, look, you either pass our model or you don't. What they don't take into effect is the company story, right? I go back to kind of the Evercore and the Netgear example. They did a really good job of kind of explaining what their story was. And so those independent shareholders, they consider that, they factor it in. And I think in a lot of cases, that's what ends up winning the day.
Yeah, what I keep hearing you say is that disclosure matters, that you're able to, and you're talking about storytelling. I mean, that's what the proxy actually has grown up over the last decade into a storytelling document, but in particular here where you think you might have a problem with getting your equity plan approved, then storytelling is even more important than perhaps the rest of the proxy.
It is. And again, it goes back to what I said earlier, right? About, getting ahead of it. You asked me the question earlier about, can you get brought in at the very end of the process at 2 weeks before? And I'm like, yeah, you can, but it's just, you tee it up. And again, you look back to the Evercore and Netgear example. I mean, we knew early on that we were going to have issues, and we were able to kind of plot these things. The other thing that I'd say about the story and about either whether it's a supplement, obviously they're tied together, is, and I'll pull up Netgear as an example. You don't need to pull up the proxy, but I just want to make a point. But for Netgear, for example, we looked at their shareholder base and we said, gosh, they've got a lot of ISS influence, or shareholders that are influenced by the ISS recommendation near the top. So when we kind of discovered early on that ISS wasn't likely to support the proposal, we were nervous, to be honest. But it allowed us to kind of prepare for both on the engagement side. We were able to engage with a lot of the holders that are influenced by ISS. We got several of them to kind of override ISS by going to the investment side, by telling our story early on. But also, when we engage with them kind of pre-proxy, we also put a lot of that information that we discussed in that supplemental as well as in the proxy statement. So, engagement also helps with telling your story.
So you referenced this other big guy that we taped about say on pay solicitation, a link to that, which is beneath this video.
Yeah.
And in that case, I mentioned, is it too late to bring in a solicitor if you get a recommend a vote against the vote? If you get a proxy advisor that recommends a vote against the say on pay, there where 70-80% is considered sort of a quasi fail, it seems to even be more important here where the vote really does, it's binding, it's not binding and pay, that waiting till you get that recommendation against seems even more dangerous to bring in a solicitor at that point. It seems like you need to get your story together beforehand and really engage you before you're even putting the pen to the proxy.
Yeah, it's a playbook, right? I mean, I always think of this as kind of a playbook. You've got your kind of strategy. We talked earlier on about kind of identifying where your potential weak spots are with respect to policy and respect to your plan, and really kind of addressing them. So yeah, absolutely agree. It's much more important on an equity plan than it is for say on pay.
So what areas might companies typically trip up on when they're trying to go it on their own?
I think one area where companies tend to trip up is when they model ISS early on and making that translation into the proxy disclosure. So in other words, not syncing up the proxy with what they modeled on the ISS consulting side. You know, they kind of get this pass from ISS. They say, this is what it's going to do, but you've got to be spot on with all of that disclosure. That disclosure in your proxy has to match up exactly with what you modeled in there. I am so like paranoid about this kind of whole process that when I'm, you know, when a company asks me to model the ISS piece of it, anytime they change a number, I'm like, okay, we got to run it through. So I see not a lot, but I do see people slip up when they think they're going to get ISS support, but they haven't done the required disclosure there to ensure, because once you kind of file that proxy, that consulting side at ISS goes away. So I think that's one area where I see people mess up. The other, ironically, is paying too much attention to what ISS says. And maybe I should say it a different way, which is not paying as much attention to your independent institutions as you probably should, right? So ISS says, well, you can ask for this many shares, and then that's just what you do. You know, what you really need to be looking at is, okay, well, what do people like a Fidelity and T. Rowe and Vanguard and BlackRock, what do they think about this share? So I think people really need to kind of do their homework and make sure they clearly understand whether a proposal that ISS may be willing to support is also going to be supported by your top institutional investors. So I think those are the two big things that I see people kind of trip up on.
And wearing my disclosure lawyer hat, just referencing something we talked about earlier, is that your summary of the plan in the body of the proxy should definitely match what's in the plan itself.
Yeah.
That's Proxy Disclosure 101.
Yeah.
So Reid, it seems like you really love this stuff that really comes through the screen here, and I'm glad you're in a job that you're passionate about. That's awesome.
I enjoy it sometimes. I enjoy it nowadays. I don't know, ask me in May how I'm enjoying it.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.